I'll just start off by saying really that there's a pretty simple question at the heart of this issue, which is, what can prosperity possibly mean in a world where the population is rapidly approaching 9 billion people, or will by the middle of the century approach 9 billion people, in a world which is constrained by finite ecological limits? The conventional answer to that question of what prosperity means is to suggest that it is a kind of increasing economy with a cornucopia of material goods and improved living conditions. And although I would accept absolutely that there's the need for increasing incomes and increasing living conditions in the developing countries, the question really is that still a legitimate focus for policy, ever increasing incomes in the advanced nations? And it probably doesn't come as a great surprise to you to know that I'm suggesting that it is not. And that leaves open, of course, the question of what prosperity could mean in such a world, and I'll touch on that very briefly. But let me just admit right at the front that this question is haunted by a quite profound dilemma. What are the horns of that dilemma? They are basically that growth is unsustainable, at least in its current form, and in anything like the form that it looks like going forward. And yet, it wouldn't be a dilemma if there wasn't another horn, and the other horn is that the opposite of growth, which turns out to be something called degrowth, or décroissance if you prefer the slightly more flamboyant and pasty-sounding French, is unstable. Growth is unsustainable. Degrowth is unstable, at least under present conditions. And I haven't really got time to talk about the reasons for that in any detail, although we can see it all around us in the panic that attends any recession. But I just want, for those who are mathematically minded, to point to this equation, the idea, in fact, that the output, the GDP, the gross domestic product, what we call economic activity, is a product of labor, people employed, times the productivity with which we employ them. And in the economies that we have, typically, the labor productivity tends to go up and up through technological innovation. So that if GDP doesn't go up and up, in fact, if it stays stable or goes down, then that can only mean one thing for the labor factor, that it has to be going down. In other words, the increase in labor productivity puts a downward pressure on our ability to employ people unless the economy grows. And this is a very profound dilemma. In fact, it's so profound that it's really tempting to ask, what are policymakers' responses to this? Largely, the policy response is to appeal to something called decoupling. So we decouple economic activity from material impacts, and we hope that we can therefore circumvent the ecological constraints that we face. And I just want to point out very briefly some of the limits to decoupling. They're fairly obvious at the global level, because in spite of all the best efforts of our attempts to reduce carbon, we have signally failed to do that over the last 17 years. In the period between the Kyoto year of 1990 and 2007, for example, carbon emissions, far from falling over that period, increased by 40%. And that's not the direction that we want to be going. You can look at all this kind of data. There's lots of it in the book. Here's another example of resource consumption data. And here, the picture, if anything, is even worse. The GDP line is swamped by increases in resource consumption. And so you have to admit that we didn't do too well in that task. Maybe we didn't try hard enough. That's certainly a possibility. How hard would we need to try in order to reverse these kinds of trends? So here's another example for you, and I just want you to look really at the left-hand side of this graph. This is the carbon intensity of economic activity in 2007. It's 768 grams of carbon dioxide per dollar. Where do we need to get to if we really want a sustainable world, a world that cuts under the carbon limits, is associated with some sense of population growth, but is also an equal world in the sense that everyone has an access to that concept of sustainability? And the answer to that question is on the right-hand side of the graph. It represents a 130-fold improvement in technological efficiency, and that's an order of magnitude faster than anything we have ever achieved in the past. And then a really interesting point, as you go forwards in time, actually by 2100 you need an economy where that number goes negative. What does that mean? It means that by 2100 economic activity everywhere, instead of pumping carbon into the atmosphere relentlessly, is pulling carbon from it? Are we anywhere able to envisage what that economy looks like? It's fascinating to me and slightly daunting that actually there's no politician anywhere who has the answer to that question. And so from that point of view, it's really a kind of question of then going back and saying, let's start with a clean slate and let's try and understand some of the dynamics of the system of economic growth that we've inherited.